1770. A restless winter night in Boston. Tension between colonists and red-coated British soldiers boils beneath the icy streets. Merchants complain of unfair taxes. Sailors curse the soldiers who patrol their town. Angry whispers echo in taverns. Are we still free men or prisoners in our own land? The streets are alive with fury, and one spark could set the city ablaze. That spark came on March 5th, when snowballs and insults turned into gunfire, and innocent blood stained the cobblestones. What began as shouts and chaos ended in death, outrage, and the cry of revolution that would shape America forever. Before we dive deeper into this bloody night, I want to hear your voice. Do you believe the Boston Massacre was a planned act of tyranny or a tragic accident of chaos? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading them all. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold true history that will chill your soul. The city of Boston in 1770 was not the bustling metropolis we know today. It was a town of narrow, winding streets, wooden houses pressed close together, and a harbor that brought both wealth and resentment. Merchants traded goods across the Atlantic, while sailors and laborers filled the taverns with noise and disputes. Yet beneath the rhythm of daily life, a storm was gathering. For years, the colonists had watched Britain tighten its grip. The Stamp Act of 1765 had already left a bitter taste in their mouths. Though it was repealed after fierce protest, the damage was done. The people of Boston had realized that Parliament across the ocean could impose laws and taxes without their consent. No taxation without representation was more than a slogan. It was a wound in their pride. Then came the Townshend Acts of 1767, placing duties on imports such as glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Every household felt the weight of these measures. The British government insisted that the money raised would pay for colonial officials, making them independent of local assemblies. For Bostonians, this meant that their voices mattered even less. The anger of a proud and stubborn people was now directed not only at Parliament, but at the men in red coats sent to enforce its will. In 1768, British regiments arrived in Boston. Their purpose was simple: to maintain order in a city that resisted authority. But their presence inflamed the very tensions they were meant to calm. Imagine a small town where thousands of residents suddenly live side by side with soldiers. The troops needed housing, and when barracks proved insufficient, they were lodged in public spaces or private buildings. Bostonians resented their presence at every turn. Worse still, the soldiers competed with locals for work. Many redcoats, poorly paid, sought part-time jobs. They worked as rope makers, dock hands, and laborers. Every shilling earned by a soldier was a shilling stolen from a Bostonian. This economic rivalry added fuel to political anger. Daily insults flew between citizens and troops. Colonists mocked the soldiers as lobsterbacks for their scarlet coats. The soldiers returned the abuse with equal venom. Fistfights broke out on street corners. Children hurled snowballs packed with stones. The atmosphere grew toxic, like a powder keg awaiting a spark. One winter day in early March 1770, a quarrel broke out between a young apprentice and a British officer. The boy accused the officer of refusing to pay a debt. Words turned into shouts, and soon a crowd gathered. The officer struck the boy, inflaming local anger. News spread quickly through the narrow streets. Crowds formed in taverns, where ale loosened tongues and sharpened tempers. Sailors, dock workers, and apprentices cursed the soldiers, vowing that Boston would not bow. The British soldiers, for their part, grew weary of constant insults and harassment. Many were far from home, enduring freezing nights in a hostile town. They feared ambushes whenever they walked alone. Their muskets were meant to give them authority, but instead they made them targets of ridicule. The fragile peace of Boston was shattering. The smallest spark could set the entire city aflame. That spark came on the night of March 5th, 1770. It was bitterly cold. Snow lay in dirty piles along the streets. Bostonians gathered in groups, muttering grievances as the wind howled. Near the custom house, a lone British sentry stood guard. His name was Private Hugh White, and he quickly became the focus of attention. A few young men began to taunt him. They shouted insults, daring him to fire his musket. Snowballs flew, some packed with ice or stones. White struck one of the men with the butt of his weapon, enraging the crowd. The noise swelled. Bells rang through the city, usually a sign of fire, but tonight it was the alarm of riot. Dozens, then hundreds gathered. Torches lit the faces of an angry mob. Cries of "Kill him!" echoed against the walls. Private White called desperately for reinforcements. Captain Thomas Preston, an officer of the 29th Regiment, marched through the snow with a small squad of soldiers. They formed a defensive line near the custom house, bayonets glinting in the torchlight. The crowd pressed closer. "Cowards! Lobsterbacks, fire if you dare!" someone shouted. Sticks, ice, and oyster shells pelted the soldiers. The men raised their muskets but received no order to shoot. Then came the chaos. A club struck one soldier, knocking him off balance. In the confusion, a musket discharged. Whether it was by accident or command, no one could say. But the sound shattered the night. The other soldiers, panicked and surrounded, opened fire. Smoke filled the air as muskets cracked in rapid succession. Screams pierced the chaos. Men staggered, clutching their chests. Blood spilled across the snow. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and native descent who became the first to fall. His death gave the event a martyr, a symbol of liberty struck down by tyranny. Others, like Samuel Gray and James Caldwell, joined him in death. Many more were wounded. The crowd dispersed in shock and horror. Silence fell over Boston, broken only by cries of grief. The massacre sent shockwaves through the colonies. Patriots like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere seized the moment. They portrayed the event not as a street brawl but as deliberate murder. Revere engraved a dramatic image, soldiers lined up in formation firing into a helpless crowd. The truth was far more chaotic, but propaganda thrives on simplicity. Captain Preston and his men were arrested. To ensure justice, the trials were delayed until passions cooled. Surprisingly, the defense attorney was none other than John Adams, future President of the United States. Adams believed that even hated soldiers deserved fair representation. His defense would later become a landmark in the principle of impartial justice. Before we continue this bloody story, I want to know your thoughts. Were the British soldiers guilty of cold-blooded murder? Or were they simply caught in a storm of chaos? Drop your opinion in the comments, because history is not just facts, it's interpretation. And don't forget, subscribe for more untold stories of crime, tragedy, and revolution. The sun rose over Boston on March 6, 1770, casting its cold light upon a city forever changed. The cobblestones where blood had flowed were stained, reminders of the 5 colonists who had fallen under musket fire the night before. Word traveled quickly. By dawn, every tavern, every market stall, every corner of the town was alive with whispers. Mothers warned their children to stay indoors. Dock workers cursed the soldiers, vowing vengeance. In churches, ministers thundered from the pulpit that tyranny had shown its true face. The British garrison remained on high alert, muskets polished and bayonets fixed, expecting that a mob could storm the barracks at any moment. The bodies of the victims were laid out for all to see. Citizens passed silently, hats in hand, some weeping openly, others clenching their fists in silent fury. For them, this was no accident. It was an attack on Boston itself. But among the anger, cooler heads asked, was it murder or a tragic accident? No man understood propaganda better than Samuel Adams. To him, the massacre was not simply a tragedy, it was an opportunity. Adams and his allies in the Sons of Liberty were determined to use the deaths as proof that the colonies could not live peacefully under British rule. They organized public funerals for the dead, ensuring that thousands would march in solemn procession behind the coffins. Bells tolled, drums beat slowly, and silence fell as the victims were lowered into their graves. It was more than mourning. It was theater, designed to etch the memory of the massacre into the soul of every colonist. Adams spread the message in newspapers and pamphlets. The massacre was not an accident, but a deliberate slaughter. He called the soldiers butchers, the king's men who had no respect for colonial lives. His cousin, John Adams, however, would take a different path, one that few could have predicted. If words stir emotions, images ignite them into fury. Paul Revere, silversmith and patriot, created a now famous engraving of the Boston Massacre. The picture shows soldiers lined up in perfect formation, calmly firing into a defenseless crowd. Their officer, Captain Preston, appears to give the command to fire. Colonists fall, blood gushing from their wounds, while the British seem almost mechanical in their cruelty. The engraving was widely circulated, copied, and reprinted. Few paused to ask whether it reflected the truth. In reality, the night of March 5th was chaotic, messy, filled with confusion. No orderly volley had been commanded, but accuracy mattered less than impact. Revere's engraving did its job. It burned into the colonial imagination the image of British soldiers as executioners of innocent Americans. Captain Thomas Preston and 8 of his soldiers were arrested and charged with murder. Private Hugh Montgomery and Matthew Kilroy, whose muskets were said to have killed men in the crowd, faced particular scrutiny. Boston was on the edge of rebellion. Crowds demanded swift punishment, but even in the face of fury, there were voices insisting that justice could not be mob-driven. Governor Hutchinson, though pressured, promised a fair trial. This, however, created another dilemma. Who would defend the soldiers, despised as they were? The answer came from an unlikely figure, John Adams, cousin of Samuel, and already respected as a brilliant lawyer. To many Bostonians, John Adams's decision to defend the British soldiers was shocking, even traitorous. How could a patriot stand beside the very men accused of murdering fellow colonists? Adams, however, believed deeply in the principle that every man deserved a fair defense. If justice was sacrificed to vengeance, then liberty itself would be meaningless. Adams accepted the case, knowing it might damage his reputation and even place his safety at risk. Yet he believed that truth must prevail. Later, he would write that his defense of the soldiers was one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. The trials were separated, beginning with that of Captain Thomas Preston. The prosecution argued that Preston had ordered his men to fire into the crowd. Witnesses claimed they heard the command, while others testified they had seen him raise his sword. But Adams's defense rested on the confusion of the night. Witnesses contradicted one another. Some swore Preston gave the order. Others insisted he did not. Adams pressed the uncertainty. In a riotous mob, could anyone truly hear with clarity? The burden of proof, he reminded the jury, was heavy. If doubt remained, they must acquit. In October 1770, the jury returned its verdict. Captain Preston was not guilty. The decision stunned some, but it also cooled the flames. Preston, though freed, was forever branded in Boston's memory as the officer of the massacre. The soldiers' trial began in November. This time, Adams faced an even greater challenge. The men had undeniably fired their weapons. The question was whether they acted in self-defense or with murderous intent. Adams spoke with precision and passion. He reminded the jury of the soldiers' situation, surrounded by a hostile mob, pelted with sticks, stones, and ice. One soldier had been knocked down with a club. The crowd dared them to fire, taunting them mercilessly. Could any man, Adams argued, remain perfectly calm in such a storm? His most famous words resounded, "Facts are stubborn things." Whatever the passions of the moment, facts could not be ignored. The law demanded justice, not vengeance. The jury deliberated and delivered its verdict. 6 of the soldiers were acquitted. 2, Privates Montgomery and Kilroy, were found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. Their punishment was branding on the thumb, a mark of guilt but far from execution. The verdicts did not please everyone. To many patriots, justice seemed too lenient. Yet the trials demonstrated something extraordinary. Even in the midst of fury, Boston had upheld the principle of fair trial. This fact, ironically, gave strength to the patriot cause. Colonists could now argue that while Britain sent soldiers to oppress them, they themselves preserved liberty and justice. For John Adams, the outcome confirmed his belief that defending the soldiers had been the right choice. His reputation did not suffer as much as he had feared. Instead, many came to respect his courage. Years later, Adams would reflect that this trial had been one of the foundations of his political career. The Boston Massacre did not ignite revolution overnight, but it lit a fire that smoldered in every colony. Newspapers carried the story far beyond Massachusetts. Pamphlets described it as the moment when Britain showed its true colors. The names of the dead, Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr, became symbols of sacrifice. Each anniversary of the massacre was marked with fiery orations. Patriots spoke of tyranny, liberty, and the blood of martyrs. Children grew up hearing the story, seeing Revere's engraving, and absorbing the message that Britain's soldiers were not protectors, but oppressors. 5 years later, when shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, many remembered March 5, 1770. The Boston Massacre was a stepping stone, a reminder that freedom required vigilance and sometimes blood. Yet behind the politics, there were human stories often forgotten. The families of the dead grieved in silence. Widows struggled to raise children without fathers. Sailors mourned their comrade Attucks, who had once walked boldly on the docks, but now lay beneath the earth. Even the soldiers, though despised, carried scars. Private Montgomery and Kilroy bore the brands of manslaughter for the rest of their lives, symbols of a night they could never escape. Captain Preston lived the remainder of his days haunted by the accusation that he had given the fatal order. History records events, but it is people who endure them. The Boston Massacre was more than a street fight. It was a turning point. It showed the danger of occupation, the volatility of mobs, and the power of propaganda. It revealed that justice could prevail even amid outrage, and it planted in colonial hearts the seeds of independence. The night of March 5, 1770 remained forever etched in memory, not only as a massacre, but as the moment when America began to see itself not just as subjects of the crown, but as a people destined for freedom. History is never silent. It speaks through blood, memory, and rebellion. The Boston Massacre was not the end, but the beginning of something far greater. Do you believe the 5 fallen men were martyrs of liberty, or victims of a tragic mistake? Share your answer in the comments. I'll be reading them all. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold history. When the trials ended in late 1770, Boston was exhausted but not at peace. The verdicts, 6 soldiers acquitted, 2 branded for manslaughter, had cooled the rage of immediate vengeance, yet the city remained haunted by the massacre. To loyalists, the legal process had proven the colonies could uphold fairness even against their own passions. To patriots, the blood spilled on King Street could never be forgotten or forgiven. In taverns and meeting halls, the arguments continued. Some claimed John Adams' defense of the soldiers was a betrayal, while others quietly admired his courage. But one fact was undeniable. Boston was forever changed. In 1771, just 1 year after the massacre, Boston held its first annual commemoration of the tragedy. The March 5 orations became tradition. Each year, leading patriots stood before crowded halls and delivered fiery speeches, honoring the fallen and condemning the tyranny of British rule. The orations were not quiet acts of mourning. They were fuel for rebellion. Samuel Adams and others ensured that the memories of Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr lived on as symbols of sacrifice. Children who had been too young to understand the massacre grew up hearing the story repeated each year, shaping their view of Britain as oppressors. Among the dead, one figure gained special prominence: Crispus Attucks. His mixed African and native heritage made him unique, and his position as the first man to fall gave him symbolic power. Patriots celebrated him as a martyr of liberty. In the decades to come, abolitionists would point to Attucks as proof that people of all races had a stake in America's freedom. In taverns and homes, his name was spoken with reverence. His image, immortalized in pamphlets and later in paintings, became a rallying point for those who believed liberty was worth dying for. The Boston Massacre was not just an event, it was a weapon. Patriots wielded it with skill, ensuring the story spread far beyond Massachusetts. Paul Revere's engraving continued to circulate, its inaccuracies ignored for the sake of emotional impact. Newspapers across the colonies printed accounts that framed the massacre as proof of Britain's brutality. Even the term massacre was propaganda. 5 deaths, tragic as they were, might not seem a massacre by strict definition. But words shape memory, and the name stuck. Loyalists protested, arguing that the soldiers had defended themselves from an unruly mob. Yet their voices were drowned by the roar of patriot orators, who insisted the massacre revealed the true face of tyranny. Though the trials had ended, the massacre's shadow stretched across the following years. Tensions remained high between colonists and soldiers. Parliament, sensing unrest, repealed most of the hated Townshend duties in 1770, leaving only the tax on tea as a symbol of its authority. For a time, the pressure eased. Trade picked up. The streets grew quieter, but beneath the calm lay bitterness. The memory of March 5th lingered in every tavern story, every sermon, every whispered conversation. Patriots used it as proof that the colonies must resist, that submission to British soldiers meant submission to death. Loyalists, meanwhile, warned that such radicalism endangered order and prosperity. The massacre had drawn a line. On one side stood those who still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. On the other stood those who believed blood had already severed the bond. It is easy to remember the massacre as politics, propaganda, and revolution. Yet behind it were ordinary lives torn apart. Samuel Maverick, only 17, had been an apprentice full of dreams for the future. His parents buried him with broken hearts. Patrick Carr, mortally wounded, gave testimony on his deathbed that suggested the soldiers had fired in panic, not cruelty, yet even his words could not soften public fury. Families carried grief silently. Children grew up without fathers. Widows struggled to survive in a harsh economy. The human cost did not always fit neatly into the grand narratives of liberty and tyranny, but it was real, and it endured long after pamphlets stopped circulating. The years between the Boston Massacre and the Revolution were shaped by echoes of that night. In 1773, when the Tea Act reignited anger, patriots drew upon the memory of the massacre to justify bold defiance. If soldiers had killed colonists for protesting taxes, then surely dumping tea into Boston Harbor was a righteous act of resistance. The Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773, was carried out in the same spirit that had fueled the annual massacre orations. When men disguised as Mohawks boarded ships and hurled chests of tea into the water, they did so with the conviction that tyranny must be resisted at all costs. And when Britain responded with the coercive acts, punishing Boston by closing its port and tightening control, colonists across America remembered the massacre. Sympathy for Boston spread. What had once seemed like a local tragedy became a symbol of all colonial suffering. By 1774, committees of correspondence ensured that the story of the massacre was known in every colony. In Virginia, Pennsylvania, and beyond, colonists spoke of March 5th as a warning of what British troops could do if left unchecked. The First Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia that year, and while they debated petitions and boycotts, the shadow of the massacre hovered over their words. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, many patriots felt it was the natural continuation of a struggle that had begun 5 years earlier in Boston. The blood on King Street had not been spilled in vain. It had prepared the colonies for revolution. Yet the Boston Massacre was more than a spark of rebellion. It also left behind a quieter legacy, one of justice and law. John Adams's defense of the soldiers, unpopular as it had been, established a principle that echoed through the new nation, that even the despised deserve a fair trial. In the years after independence, Adams often looked back on the trial as one of his proudest moments. To him, it proved that the cause of liberty was not about mob vengeance, but about justice, fairness, and the rule of law. That principle would later shape the Constitution and the American legal system. Thus, the massacre left 2 legacies, one of resistance to tyranny and another of commitment to justice. Both would define the United States. Decades passed, the Boston Massacre grew into legend. Artists painted dramatic scenes, often exaggerating the violence. Writers cast the victims as heroes who had knowingly sacrificed themselves for liberty. Speeches at annual commemorations grew more fiery, more symbolic, until the actual details of the night faded beneath layers of myth. Yet myths are powerful. They inspire, unite, and endure. The massacre became a chapter in the great story of American independence, its truths mingling with its exaggerations to create a narrative that fueled generations. The Boston Massacre was never forgotten. It was not the largest battle, nor the deadliest. It involved only a handful of soldiers and townspeople. Yet its impact was immense. It revealed the fragility of peace under occupation, the danger of mistrust, and the power of memory. From the blood on King Street flowed two rivers, one leading to revolution, the other to justice. Together they formed the foundation of a nation. The massacre's victims became martyrs of liberty, their deaths remembered each march as reminders that freedom has a price. And when Americans declared independence in 1776, the echo of that snowy night in Boston still rang in their hearts. The Boston Massacre is more than history. It's a story of memory, justice, and struggle that still echoes today. Do you think the fallen men should be remembered as martyrs of liberty or ordinary victims of chaos? Drop your honest answer in the comments. I'll be reading every thought. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful untold stories of the past. The Boston Massacre was a spark that ignited the flame of revolution, but its legacy did not end with independence. Long after the colonies became the United States, the story of that bloody night continued to shape American identity. Every generation found something new in the event: justice, sacrifice, race, liberty, or the danger of unchecked power. It was not just a story frozen in the past. It became a mirror, reflecting the struggles of each era. The Revolution, the annual March 5th orations, continued for a time, though the focus gradually shifted. By the early 1780s, the colonies had won their independence. The Boston Massacre was remembered not simply as a tragedy, but as the first chapter in a victorious struggle. The victims were honored as martyrs whose deaths helped birth a new nation. Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr were remembered not only as men, but as symbols. Monuments and engravings ensured that their names were not forgotten. In Boston, King Street, where the massacre took place, became sacred ground. It was the place where ordinary citizens had stood against the most powerful empire in the world, and though blood was shed, it proved that resistance could not be silenced. No figure from the massacre gained more symbolic weight than Crispus Attucks. In the early republic, his story was invoked to show that all men, regardless of background, had fought for liberty. Attucks was of African and native descent, and in a nation still deeply scarred by slavery, his name carried special meaning. By the mid-19th century, abolitionists held Attucks up as proof that black men had sacrificed for America from the very beginning. During rallies and speeches, his name was spoken as a reminder that the struggle for freedom was not confined to one race. Frederick Douglass himself pointed to Attucks as a hero, proof that liberty and equality were inseparable. For many, Attucks became the first true American to give his life for independence. His death, once seen simply as tragic, became a beacon for movements that demanded America live up to its ideals. In 1888, more than a century after the massacre, Boston unveiled the Crispus Attucks Monument on Boston Common. The dedication ceremony drew thousands, including African-American leaders and politicians who saw the moment as more than commemoration. It was recognition. Attucks and the other victims were finally honored with stone and inscription. The monument depicts the fallen men and bears their names, reminding visitors that liberty had a price. For the black community in particular, the recognition of Attucks was powerful. It symbolized both inclusion in the national story and a challenge to the nation to honor its promises of equality. The massacre's site, marked today by a circle of cobblestones near the old State House, became another place of memory. Tourists stand where colonists once fell, listening to guides retell the story that has become both history and legend. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Boston Massacre had become a staple of American education. Schoolchildren learned of Paul Revere's engraving, Samuel Adams' speeches, and the bravery of ordinary Bostonians who stood against tyranny. The story was simplified for textbooks, colonists brave, soldiers cruel, but its impact remained. Generations of students grew up seeing the massacre as the opening act of the American Revolution. The names of Attucks and his fellow victims appeared in lessons, ensuring that even children could recite the event as a foundational story of liberty. In many ways, the massacre was taught not just as history, but as morality, a warning of what happens when power is unchecked, and a celebration of those who dare to resist. In the 20th century, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, the memory of Crispus Attucks surged again. Leaders invoked his name as proof that Black Americans had always been central to the nation's story. If the first blood shed for independence was that of a man of color, how could the nation deny the rights of his descendants? Attucks became a rallying figure in speeches, marches, and classrooms. His story was taught not only as part of the revolution, but as part of the ongoing fight for equality. Monuments were rededicated, and schools and community centers bore his name. The Boston Massacre thus bridged centuries, connecting the revolution to the struggle for civil rights. It reminded Americans that liberty was not given, but fought for, often by those marginalized in their own time. Today, the Boston Massacre is remembered each year in reenactments and ceremonies. On King Street, actors in colonial garb recreate the confrontation, drawing crowds who watch as insults, snowballs, and muskets bring history to life. The reenactment is both spectacle and education, reminding modern Bostonians that their city was once the heart of revolution. Inside the Old State House Museum, artifacts tell the story: musket balls, engravings, trial transcripts, and letters. Visitors learn not only of the deaths, but of John Adams's famous defense, which has become a cornerstone of America's legal tradition. For Boston, the massacre is not just local history, it is civic identity. For the nation, it remains a symbol of the cost of liberty. The Boston Massacre endures because it offers lessons that transcend its time. On justice, John Adams's defense showed that even in the face of outrage, fairness must prevail. His insistence on facts over passion became a model for the American legal system. On propaganda, Paul Revere's engraving revealed the power of media to shape memory. Though not entirely accurate, it captured the spirit of the event and ensured that colonists saw the massacre as tyranny, not accident. On sacrifice, the deaths of ordinary men, sailors, workers, apprentices, proved that revolution was not only the work of leaders but of common people willing to risk everything. On diversity, the legacy of Crispus Attucks showed that the struggle for liberty crossed boundaries of race and status. His martyrdom became proof that America's story has always been broader than the dominant narrative. These lessons continue to resonate, reminding each generation of the responsibilities that come with freedom. Like all great historical events, the Boston Massacre is surrounded by myth. The engraving by Paul Revere, the speeches of Samuel Adams, and the orations of later patriots painted the event in bold, dramatic colors. Reality was more complex. Confusion, fear, and human error played as much a role as tyranny. Yet myths, while imperfect, serve a purpose. They give meaning to sacrifice and unify communities. The massacre-esque myth helped colonists imagine themselves not as subjects of Britain, but as a people destined for independence. And in that sense, the myth became as important as the truth. In the 21st century, the Boston Massacre continues to hold relevance. It is studied not only as the prelude to revolution, but as a case study in media, justice, and protest. In times of political division, Americans look back at 1770 and see echoes of their own struggles, debates about authority, protest, and the power of ordinary citizens. Crispus Attucks remains a national symbol. His name appears in discussions of race, identity, and belonging. He stands as a reminder that the first blood shed for America's freedom was not that of a general or statesman, but of a sailor of mixed heritage, an outsider who became central to the story of a nation. The cobblestones on King Street, the monument on Boston Common, the annual reenactments, all ensure that the massacre is not forgotten. The Boston Massacre was not the revolution itself, but it was the drumbeat before the storm. It showed the cost of occupation, the fragility of peace, and the danger of mistrust. More importantly, it revealed that ordinary lives, once spilled into the snow, could fuel a movement that reshaped the world. From 1770 to today, the massacre's echoes continue. In classrooms, in speeches, in monuments, and in movements for justice, its story is retold. Its victims live on not as forgotten names but as symbols of sacrifice and liberty. The Boston Massacre teaches that freedom is never free. It is earned, defended, and remembered. And as long as America remembers that snowy night on King Street, it remembers the price of its independence. History is not just about the past. It is about what lessons we choose to carry into the future. The Boston Massacre shows us how fear, anger, and injustice can change nations forever. Do you believe moments like this could still happen today? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them all. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. The Boston Massacre of 1770 was not simply a bloody clash in a colonial town. It was the moment when the fragile bond between Britain and its American colonies was shattered beyond repair. For years, grievances had simmered: taxes, military presence, lack of representation. But the sight of men lying dead in the snow made the abstract real. No longer were arguments about distant parliaments and kings merely words. Blood had sealed the dispute. In this final exploration of the Boston Massacre's legacy, we trace not just what happened that night or in the immediate years after, but how its memory rippled through the decades, shaping politics, identity, and the very meaning of liberty. By the time of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the massacre had become a cornerstone of revolutionary propaganda, a rallying cry for unity, and a symbol of sacrifice. In 1770, many colonists were shocked and enraged, but the colonies were still divided. Not everyone wanted separation from Britain. For many loyalists, the massacre was a tragic accident inflamed by reckless crowds. Yet patriots like Samuel Adams ensured that the deaths would not fade from memory. Through newspapers, engravings, and public orations, they transformed a chaotic confrontation into a deliberate act of tyranny. This transformation from event to symbol was crucial. Ordinary men, Attucks, Gray, Caldwell, Maverick, Carr, became martyrs. The site became a shrine. Annual commemorations kept the flame alive. For a people searching for identity, the massacre was evidence that they were already a nation under threat, bound together by shared loss. No event becomes immortal without storytellers. The massacre was preserved and magnified by speeches and printed works. Samuel Adams and others delivered yearly addresses reminding citizens of the cruel and bloody massacre, urging vigilance against tyranny. Paul Revere's engraving, widely circulated, etched into the minds of colonists a dramatic image: soldiers in formation, firing into an innocent, unarmed crowd. The image ignored the confusion and threats of the night itself. But that was the point. It was not about accuracy, but about persuasion. The massacre entered colonial homes not as messy reality, but as righteous outrage. By the early 1770s, the massacre had become part of a chain reaction. The Tea Act of 1773 and the Boston Tea Party followed, events steeped in the memory of March 5th. Each confrontation drew energy from the image of British soldiers killing colonists in cold blood. When Britain responded with the coercive acts, the colonies rallied together. The First Continental Congress of 1774 invoked the massacre as proof of British oppression. Delegates argued that if Britain could station troops to kill colonists in Boston, no colony was safe. By the time the shots at Lexington and Concord rang out in 1775, the Boston Massacre was no longer one event, but a symbol of a decade's worth of oppression. It had primed colonists to believe that independence was not only desirable but necessary. One of the most fascinating dimensions of the massacre was John Adams's defense of the soldiers. By securing acquittals for most, Adams demonstrated the rule of law, even for enemies. His actions earned him criticism, but history judged him differently. For Adams, justice had to transcend anger. Ironically, the man who defended British soldiers later became a founding father, and the second President of the United States. The massacre was therefore not only about violence but also about the birth of principles that would define America: fairness, due process, and the idea that law must not bend to mob fury. Crispus Attucks' role as the first to fall gave his name extraordinary weight. For contemporaries, he was proof that ordinary workers, not just elites, fought for liberty. For abolitionists in the 19th century, he became evidence that African Americans had always sacrificed for America, long before emancipation. His story was invoked during the Civil Rights Movement as a reminder that the first blood spilled for American freedom was that of a man of color. In this way, the Boston Massacre connected struggles across centuries, from colonial independence to racial equality. Attucks is remembered today as a symbol of inclusion, proof that America's founding story was not the work of one group alone, but of diverse voices and sacrifices. Every nation needs myths, and the Boston Massacre became one of America's earliest. Like the story of Washington and the cherry tree, or the ride of Paul Revere, the massacre was retold in ways that highlighted ideals rather than complexities. The image of innocent patriots gunned down by cold-blooded soldiers simplified the story, but it gave the revolution moral clarity. The narrative allowed colonists to frame their rebellion not as treason, but as self-defense. The massacre thus served not just as memory, but as justification. The Boston Massacre's legacy extended beyond the Revolution. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederate voices invoked it. Union leaders to show that liberty required sacrifice, Confederates to argue that tyranny must always be resisted. In the 20th century, as America faced new challenges, the massacre remained a touchstone. Protest movements, whether against war, inequality, or injustice, often compared their struggles to the colonists' stand in 1770. The phrase Boston Massacre itself became shorthand for state violence against the people, used in headlines and speeches whenever authorities clashed with citizens. The massacre had transcended Boston. It became universal. Memory also lived in physical spaces. The circle of cobblestones marking the site in Boston, the old State House looming nearby, and the monument on Boston Common dedicated to Attucks and his fellow victims, all ensured that the massacre remained tangible. Generations visited, reflected, and reimagined the meaning of those events. For some, the site was sacred ground of liberty. For others, it was a reminder of the fragility of peace and the dangers of fear. Standing on King Street today, it is easy to imagine the crowd, the snow, the smoke, and the chaos that erupted into history. The stones beneath one's feet are silent witnesses to the night that changed America. It teaches that power without trust breeds disaster. Soldiers in Boston were not there to massacre. They were there to enforce order. But mistrust, resentment, and poor decisions turned order into bloodshed. It teaches that truth and myth intertwine. The facts of the massacre were messy, but the story that lived on was clear and powerful. Nations often need stories more than details. It teaches that sacrifice gives birth to identity. The fallen men were not famous, not wealthy, not leaders. They were ordinary citizens, and their deaths gave extraordinary momentum to a cause that changed the world. The Boston Massacre remains relevant because its themes are eternal. Whenever governments clash with protesters, whenever media shapes events into symbols, whenever ordinary people rise in defense of liberty, echoes of March 5, 1770 can be heard. It reminds us that liberty requires vigilance, that justice must stand above passion, and that stories of sacrifice live longer than bullets or bayonets. The 5 men who died that night could not have known they were shaping history, yet their blood watered the soil of revolution, and from it grew a nation. The Boston Massacre was not the largest battle of the Revolution. It was not the bloodiest, nor the most strategically important. Yet it holds a unique place in American history because it was a beginning. It was the first moment when the cost of freedom was paid in lives. From the snow-stained cobblestones of King Street rose a cry that carried through decades, across wars, and into the hearts of generations. It was a cry that demanded liberty, that remembered sacrifice, and that warned of the dangers of unchecked power. The Boston Massacre ended lives, but it gave birth to a nation. And as long as America endures, so too will the memory of that night in 1770, when ordinary men became martyrs and history was forever changed.